Sega. Though its early console iterations were mostly overlooked, the Genesis is what put it on the map definitively. With its sleek design surface, huge selection of games, and impeccable marketing strategy, the Genesis wasn't merely a competitor to the top, it was perhaps the greatest 16-bit console of all time. Welcome to the brand new channel, where we take a look at gaming throughout the generations. The goal of these videos is to identify key components of every console and compare it to its nearest competitors. Each console will be broken down into multiple sections, focusing on critical aspects which have largely been overlooked in the past. First, hardware. We examine the hardware, motherboard, and specs. Next, games. We look at the standout titles and see how they hold up. And then marketing and sales, where we analyze the brand, marketing, profits, and legal of the system. With these three parts, and perhaps a fourth or fifth, we can create a clearer picture as to what the console was all about and see just how well it stacks up. Okie dokie. Gonna play me some Sega. Gonna place this right here, right there. And Sega Genesis. Hey y'all, welcome to the very first episode of the Console Stackup, where we compare consoles throughout the generations. First up, Sega Genesis. Now, the Genesis was first released in Japan on October 29, 1988, under the name Mega Drive. It was officially released in the USA on August 14, 1989. And incredibly enough, it went on for 8 more years, discontinuing production in 1997. However, Sega then licensed the rights to Majesco, who made the console for another 2 years. This was, for lack of imagination, dubbed the Model 3. Now, while this may seem a little strange today, back in the day, not so much. A lot of companies, namely Nintendo and Atari, used to sign licensure agreements with third parties in order to prolong the production of a certain console. In fact, Tectoy of Brazil, At Games of America, and Blaze Europe of Europe are reportedly still making consoles today. Now, while it might be fun to take a look at those, for our first episode, we're going to take it real simple. We're looking at the Model 1 Sega Genesis, produced by Sega themselves. This Black Beauty is an 11 by 8.5 inch console with a 2.5 inch height at its maximum. The sleek design exterior was a direct representation of the times. And the 80s boasted sleek black cars, big black shades, leather black jackets, heck, everything was just cooler black. And this console was no exception. The console's aesthetics was definitely a product of its time. I mean, you can clearly see the 16-bit logo in bold, straight in your face. But what's a bit? Why is there 16 of them? Well, a bit can be likened to a data storage. Kind of like ones and zeros. Stick around for the breakdown to get a fuller picture, but suffice it to say, 16-bit means how powerful it was. Now what's really interesting here are the knobs and doohickeys in the bottom left-hand corner. You got your standard on-off switch, typical reset button, and... oh? What is this? That's right. This is a volume switch that controls the sound coming from a special stereo output in case you wanted to listen in full stereo in your headphones or what have you. And trust me, this is the way to go, considering the back port is mono only. Anyway, back to the goods. The front also displays 2 controller ports, A and B, for all your 2-player needs. The left side of the console is pretty bare, save for this secret hatchet which displays a bright red protrusion. Well, obviously, we are going to take a look at that. But when we do, it says, do not remove. Could have been a little easier to read then, don't you think, Sega? Anyway, this has to be removed in order to allow the expansion bay to hook up to the Sega CD, which is an upgraded module to allow your Genesis to play CD games. But I bet you all knew that, right? However, this video is focusing on the Genesis Model 1 only. For now, that is. And I kinda don't have a Sega CD or 32X yet. Now comes the specs. In this model Genesis, we have our typical RF out, which uses this cable here, and with the channel switcher on either channel 3 or channel 4, it produces a relatively cruddy quality picture, but it is reliable. It also has an audio and video out for improved quality video. But what's the difference? Well, RF holds everything on one wire, so it's easy, but the brightness will be dampened and there will be some visual artifacting. The composite audio video, or AV, will smooth out the picture a bit, so it is the preferred method. Notice the clear textures on the right as opposed to the grainy image on the left. However, this composite cable only has a yellow and white cable. Yellow is video, and white and red are sound, but there's no red here, so this leaves this console only with a mono out. Now, from what I understand, some of these early model ones also had a special EXT port, which would be used to connect multiple consoles together. It never really caught on, so they stopped making it, but it would have been a cool idea. Anyway, lastly, the console has an adapter port for power, which requires a specific power supply. Okay, now there are tons of different power adapters for consoles. Some use similar power supplies, others start large fires and destroy your homes. Be sure to use the right one. I cannot tell you how many times I myself have gotten the wrong power adapter from local game shops. The Genesis uses a hefty brick-looking MK1602 model power supply, utilizing an input of 120 volts AC, 60 Hz, 18 watts output, 9 VDC 1. I don't know what I just said, but I do know the importance of having the right power supply, and now so should you. Fun fact, this power supply right here will work with the Master System, which was the system that came out before the Genesis. Unfun fact, it doesn't work with Model 2s or Model 3s. Is that some sort of sick joke, Sega? I'm not laughing. Now with that out of the way, let's just take a moment to take a step back and bask in the wonderful glow of the high definition. Oh my god! It's gone! I swear, it said high definition graphics. Give me one second. It says it right there. High definition graphics. Oh jeez. Here we go. Not all Sega Genesis were made equal. And I don't just mean the models. There were different variations of each model. I only have one Sega Genesis, and it's a Model 1, but as I understand it, there are 8 different variations of the Model 1. Now, the numbering of the variations is a little odd, I must admit. According to my sources, there is no North American Variation 1, which very well could have either have been a beta console, or more likely, the original Mega Drive from good old Japan. Now it seems that models 2 through 6 all use the high definition graphics moniker atop the system, and for variants 6.5 through 7, they didn't. Now let me state, there are no differences in graphical capabilities between any of the variants. Technically speaking, at least. When we open this sucker up, we'll get a better idea of what's really going on. But what is of interesting note is TMSS, or Trademark Security System. The Trademark Security System was a way for Sega to ensure that only games licensed by Sega would be able to work on the Genesis. This was a result of 2 things. First, the game publisher Accolade, amongst other third-party developers, reverse-engineered Sega's security systems. This allowed them to create their own games without needing Sega's seal of approval. And 2, this was merely an attempt to replicate Nintendo's seal of quality to make sure that only quality games could be sold through a licensure agreement, which meant they got a cut of the money. Now, if you think all this legal mumbo-jumbo and marketing is interesting, stick around to part 3, where we go into an in-depth analysis of what's really going on. But for right now, let's get back to tech specs. Now, generally speaking, the TMSS variants include any of the variations. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but from my own experiences, I've seen TMSS in early and late models. So what does TMSS really mean? Basically, the Trademark Security System was a way for Sega to ensure that third-party developers who didn't have this coding couldn't play the games on their console. Now, I wanted to test it for myself, but I have a non-TMSS Sega. Now is the moment of truth, where we open up this bad boy and get a little nitty-gritty. Now this is easy enough to disassemble. A couple of screws in the back. Once that's complete, carefully lift the top, as it is connected to a wire indicating the on light. Then remove the remaining screws in the heat shield to get access to the real goods. Ain't she a beauty underneath? To start off with, let's take it easy. Let's look at some of these buttons. This squishy guy here, that's the reset button. This switch over here controls the power, and lastly, this stick-looking thing controls the volume on the stereo output. Next up, let's take a look at the processor, or should I say processors. The main processor is the 32-bit microprocessor known as the Motorola 68K with a 16-bit external data bus. Unless, of course, you have this particular model, which instead has a Hitachi 68K. Essentially, it is the same as the Motorola, but through a licensure agreement, they were allowed to produce 68Ks for the Sega as well. This is not uncommon, as a lot of companies, not just hardware producers, would get raw materials from various suppliers in order to produce the supplier's bargaining power. Totally off track, but this is exactly why some SNESs would yellow a little more than others. Okay, back to Sega. Now this is pretty interesting. First off, who knew Motorola made CPUs? And secondly, this is what we call a 16/32-bit CPU. What this means is that the internal processor is 32-bit. This calculates how many calculations it can make per second, kind of like the brain of the operation. Now, the higher and faster the number, the better it is. But it only has a 16-bit data bus. Now think of that as how fast it can shovel all the information out. And the 16-bit is kind of what makes it a 16-bit console. So why the 32? The idea here was forward compatibility. This means that this processing chip would be compatible with future computers and add-ons, like the 32X. Now, as you guys probably already know, the 32X is an add-on for the Genesis, and when I get one, I will tell you guys all about it. Back to the processor. The M68K runs at about a staggering 7.6 MHz, or 7,600,000 cycles a second. This measures the general speed of the console. So we have this M68K performing operations for most of the console. Then what is this guy for? According to then director Masami Ishikawa, the Genesis would have two processors in order to lessen the overall stress on the console, a graphical component and an audio component. The Z80 acted as the audio component, however, it could enter a special Mark III mode where it could play older Master System games, because in fact, the Z80 was the processor in the Master System. However, when this was done, it would revert back to its normal processors in what's called Genesis mode, or Mega Drive mode. Now, this is just crazy. The Z80 was the main chip in tons of other consoles, but for this console, it was merely the sound chip. Now the main reason why Sega used the 16-bit processor in the Genesis was because, well, all the arcades were doing the same thing. Most arcades used a 16-bit processor, and by having a console with a similar CPU, it would be very easy for developers to transfer ports over to the Genesis, which they did. A lot. Moving on, earlier I said that technically all the video quality was essentially the same in all the Model 1 Genesises. Well, this is kind of true. Most of the variations used the CXA1145 video encoder powered by the M68K. This means that they should all be the same, right? No. Not at all. God, why? Capacitors. These guys are what store energy in the console and release this energy to perform tasks, almost like a mini battery. When these start to go bad, then whatever they're connected to also goes bad. And when the capacitors are connected to the video chips, well, when they go bunk, you experience a phenomena known as rainbow banding. Notice the odd vertical colors appearing. The way to tell if your capacitors go bad is if you get this rainbow banding, or if the capacitors are expanding, bulging, or even leaking. Though, don't worry. It is possible to replace these with new ones to fix your problems. These capacitors are also connected to the sound chip, which again is processed by that good old Z80. Now, variations 2 through 6.8 all use the discrete Yamaha 2612 sound chip as the main sound processor. In addition to this, they also have a TI, Texas Instrument, SN7649 PSG to handle older sounds in the master system, similar to how the Z80 did. This discrete model utilized FM synthesis with a digital to audio converter, but in the process introduced a lot of sound artifacting, muffling the overall sound. So, in Variation 7, they used the ASIC Yamaha 3438, which supposedly combined both sound chips and fixed a lot of these issues. So this means that Variation 7 has the best quality, right? No, not at all. Thing's a piece of junk. And technically, the chip was better. However, in order to accommodate for this new architecture, they changed some of the mixers and amplifiers, which gave out this muffled, horrible, distorted sound. It's just shoveling auditory crud into your ear sockets. Well, might as well take a look at what I've got. No. No. Oh, no. I have the stinker. Well, time to toss you in the trash. You may be a stinky pile of junk, but you are my stinky pile of junk. Besides, the video isn't quite done yet. Additional specifications of the console hold as stated. There is 72 kilobytes of RAM, or random access memory. Think of this as the data held while the console is on. It has 64 kilobytes of VRAM, which is just RAM for your video chip. And it has up to 1 megabyte of ROM, or read-only memory. Think of this as the memory that stays even when the console is turned off, thanks to a battery. The console is capable of producing up to 64 colors from a 512 palette to choose from. The display is 320 by 224 pixel picture, with a 32 by 32 sprite limit and up to 80 sprites on screen simultaneously. This console also has a fill rate of 6.9 megapixels per second. Now think of this as the amount of pixels the console can produce on a screen per second. This is 6.9 million per second. Lastly, and don't think I forgot, the console employs a tactic known as blast processing. What is blast processing? Well, stick around to part 3 where we go into an in-depth analysis of what it really means. But for right now, suffice it to say it means 2 things. 1, fast clock speed of the CPU. And 2, the powerful DMA controller of the Yamaha YM7107 video display graphics processor. This means that the console could write data to the video RAM during active gaming and would allow for higher fill rates, higher resolutions, faster parallax scrolling, and an increased sprite size. Alright, well that explains most of the basics, but we're not quite done yet. This system uses cartridges, which allow for the lockout security to work. Cartridges also allow for faster load times in the newly introduced CD technology, and uses less RAM, which allows for more processing power to be used elsewhere at the cost of some capacity. The average size of these cartridges were about 4 megabytes, and most had a battery inside to save data, typically a CR2032, which is used a lot in a lot of stuff, as we will see. In part 2, we will go into more detail on these. Lastly, let's take a look at the controller. Now, there happens to be a few variations, but we're going to take a look first at this MK1650. This giant controller is pretty comfortable and was designed for adult hands, which resonated very well with consumers. The curved edges and black design fit the console's aesthetics perfectly. The controller has a 4-way D-pad that feels nice, and 3 buttons with a standard off-center start button. There were other versions as well with a 3-button interface. Some had stiffer or looser D-pads, but they were all pretty much the same. The other controller I have here is the MK1470. Thanks to Classic Game Room, I know there happens to be 2 variations of this same number. Why they did this? I don't know. I just tell it like it is. Just doing it. The 1470 may have been a little smaller, but it compensated by having 6 buttons to accommodate some other games which required a lot of buttons, and it even had a turbo option. Now that is smart thinking, Sega. If we open it up, we can see the circuit board with these nice pads everywhere. Think of these pads as the contacts which allow the circuit to be complete. When I push this button, it completes the circuit and sends a signal to the cord to the console. Pretty cool. Alright. Now, let's take a step back and see what we uncovered. Interesting. But aren't we missing something? I mean, this is the console stack-up. Shouldn't we compare it to another console? Well, being the first episode, we have nothing to compare it to yet. But stick around in part 2 where you might get another hint as to what the next console will be. And in part 2, we're going to take a better look at some of the games the Genesis has to offer.